he realized he was caught up in this mode where he derived his value in life from what other people thought of him. So he explained, like, you can get rid of all the auditory noise, even all the informational noise, but unless you shift the internal perception of sound and stimulus toward an appreciation of the present moment, an appreciation of silence, unless you do that, the noise will persist. But he says the opportunity, once you do that, is to become a connoisseur of creation.
I'm Leigh Marz. I'm a collaboration consultant and leadership coach to federal agencies and major companies. Also a longtime student of the ritualized use of psychedelics in the West. And on Ever Forward Radio today, we talk about silence, the power of silence in a world of noise, how to find it, why it matters, and how it can change your life.
And I'm Justin Zorn. I've worked as both a meditation teacher and a legislative director in the US Congress. I'm a partner with Astrea Strategies along with Leigh, and we help responsible businesses, nonprofits, and leaders turn down the noise to find creative solutions. And today we're talking about our new book, Golden, The Power of Silence in a World of Noise. And the world is noisier than it's ever been, not just to our ears, but also on our screens and in our heads. This is a book about why silence matters for our personal and collective well-being. It's about how to find silence in a noisy world.
All good, but yeah,
I know.
Let's pick up there. I was kind of talking about how getting still and getting quiet being one of the most powerful modalities I have discovered and implemented and prioritized for a lot of facets of my wellness, but specifically my mental and emotional state, my mental and emotional healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly why we got interested in silence as a modality. We wanted something we thought that was pretty innate to being human, like just recognizable in our DNA, whether it's like maybe some distant childhood memory, a relationship we have to silence. A lot of people that we spoke with, and this is my experience, it might be just really taking your childlike wonder, and I was a child with that childlike wonder, into the forest and being like a deep observer to the water striders on the tops of the water, or the crane fly larvas, or the bullfrogs eating the crane fly larvas, just like being this deep observer where there's not a great separation of self and other, and getting so quiet in that way. And I remember that, even though I don't allot myself so much or as often as I should that time, some part of me knows this route to silence, to quiet. And we wanted something that was accessible today and scalable for the type of problems we're struggling with, the level and volume of noise that we're contending with. It's untenable, and not everybody's way to finding silence is going to be meditation. Even if that is our way for some period of time in our lives, it's been a big part of our lives in the past. We call ourselves lapsed meditators, kind of tongue in cheek, except for it's totally true. We are lapsed meditators at this point. And, Justin used to teach meditation in Congress to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And I brought that work into leadership work and organizational work, and even with federal agencies. But at this stage of our lives, we're looking for something even more simple, even more accessible, and even more scalable. And so that's why we turned to silence. And I'm seeing Justin.
I see
sorry,
Justin.
one
Yeah,
second.
Speaking of, he just is going to join us here. So
Okay.
we're getting a twofer, everybody.
That's right. Exciting.
If you're watching the video, we should have Mr. Justin pop up here on the screen any second now.
Hi there.
Hey, there he is.
Hey,
all right.
geez, I am so sorry, man.
Not even a thing. I know you're going through a lot right now. So I'm glad you could join us after all. And I hope the little one's okay.
Doing okay. Yeah, doing okay. She has a little bit of a fever, but, par for the course, having 2-year-old twins and a 5-year-old. So,
I don't know, not yet, but I can imagine. Yeah.
You can imagine. Yeah.
I don't know if you'll know twins, but some.
We'll see. Well, Leigh was just kind of giving me the quick breakdown there. I was sharing with her that I recommended so often the power of stillness and getting quiet and getting still, and what it can do for a lot of different things in our life, but particularly just our overall wellness and sanity. And one of the first things I want to bring up, one of the first two things I want to get up to, because in the book, I was just so impressed with how you all started off with the science behind silence, and how it poses a really unique question. Is there actually technically a thing as silence? Just like the energy of what is going on in, air quote here, nothingness. But before I do that, I just caught myself. I was actually listening to a recent interview of yours with the homie Darren O'Lean. Great interview, by the way. Love that guy. The great show. And I caught myself. I was actually on a walk this morning, and I put in my AirPods and activated the noise canceling feature in them. And it just made me think for the first time ever how I was taking for granted something that was a convenience and sounded cool and made me able to listen to an audiobook or a podcast on a walk and not be bombarded with even more noise. The technological way to introduce silence into my life. It made me think of this question. Are we at a place where we are maybe relying on technology to provide silence? It might serve us and it might get us to the point of so we can get still and get quiet. But if I can just tap something in my ear to introduce a state of silence, am I missing the mark? Am I not getting the most bang for my buck in this practice of seeking out and introducing and keeping silence in my life?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I'll start us off, and then I'll have Justin take us towards the science you mentioned. But we are definitely sensitive to that. We didn't want to write a book, for example, filled with technological hacks for getting around this noise problem, because we figure it is telling us something really important about ourselves, the state of things, the state of our interior landscapes and our internal silence, if you will, and the external landscape where we include both the auditory noise and the informational noise, the mass proliferation of information available to us today. So the decibel levels we're, of course, talking about, and that is absolutely on the rise. So we look at like sirens as a proxy indicator for that. So our emergency sirens are 6 times the volume they were before. In the last 100 years, they've gone up 6 times.
I think in LA, they're 16 times.
16 times, yeah. That was an LA specific, so I'll take your word for it. It is definitely loud. It is deafening when these sirens come past us. And that is in order to cut through the surrounding din. So, that tells you right there, we're a lot louder. But the informational noise, we quote Eric Schmidt, the past CEO of Google, who estimates that since the dawn of civilization to 2003, we have created that much content, that much information every 2 days. So every 2 days, we generate that much content. So there is a mass proliferation of information that is grabbing for our attention increasingly with like push notifications, pinging, zigging, all these things. And our attention has not increased. Our ability to process that information has not increased in any meaningful way. So we're at quite a crossroads here. And then that we look at, what does that happen? What does that do to our internal soundscapes? So the levels of noise, the internal chatter, the rumination, the worry, the fear, the anxiety that we're running. Professor from University of Michigan, Ethan Cross, estimates that we listen to something like 320 State of the Union addresses every day inside of condensed speech. So we have a lot of noise that we're contending with. And we get that sometimes you might want to turn, you're working in an open office environment, noise canceling might be the difference between you getting to work and not. There's all kinds of things, but yet we just didn't want to direct all of our attention to a tech hack or something that costs something, when really it's our birthright to be able to have pristine attention, no matter what gadgetry we may own or be into.
Truly, yeah. And Justin, I would love for you to chime in on the aspect I was highlighting about what caught my attention the most from your work. Was I was blown away at the science behind silence. And like I said, my takeaway was kind of like, are we ever really in true silence? Like the energetic aspect of silence, of quote, lack of noise, does it even exist? And, and even in that space, there's a whole other process going on beyond just getting quiet.
Totally. Chase, I love this question. And we look at this in the book. Is there even such a thing as silence? We look at the story of John Cage, the 20th century musician, composer, who went into an anechoic chamber on the Harvard campus in the 1940s, supposedly totally soundless room. And when he got there, he heard two sounds, one high-pitched and one low-pitched. And he said to the engineer in charge, he said, hey, I don't think this thing is working as it's advertised. Yeah. And he said, oh, no. The engineer said, yeah, it is. He said, the high-pitched sound is your nervous system in operation.
Yeah, wow.
The low-pitched sound is your blood in circulation. So we look at that and we say, well, what is silence then? If there's no place you can go that's totally silent. You know, one level we say silence is the absence of noise. You know, not all sound, but the absence of noise in the sense of unwanted distraction, in the sense of nothing making claims on your consciousness, in the sense of nothing interfering with your clear perception and intention. And that's why when we think about silence, we often think about quiet spaces, but sometimes they're spaces that are high decibel, but they're like flow states where there's no self-referential thought, where there's nothing interfering with clear perception and intention, because we're in the silence of the moment. And this kind of silence, Chase, is a silence that isn't just the absence of noise, it's a presence unto itself. You know, we could tap into that. And, you know, there's a lot of research out there now, a lot of scientific research about noise as stress. Noise is a driver of the fight or flight response. And scientists have seen in various disciplines, medical researchers have seen the relationship between noise and diminished cognitive capacity, as well as cardiovascular disease, stroke, depression, a host of other issues. But there's also this emerging field of research of the power of silence as a presence unto itself. There was some research that was done at Duke Medical School looking at the effects of different types of sound on the brains of mice. And it was silence more than classical music, more than white noise, more than mice pup sounds that stimulated the growth of neurons in the hippocampus, which is the region of the brain that's associated
Wow.
with memory.
Wow.
So what those researchers found was that the act of trying to hear in silence, of listening to nothing, actually activates the brain in a way that promotes positive neural development.
A lot of things come to mind there in no particular order. I think you bring up a really interesting concept of something we've probably heard before, the difference between listening and hearing. More often than not, we're hearing, not listening. We walk outside, we hear a siren, we hear noise, we hear traffic, we hear a phone call, we hear a notification, we hear everything. That is not active, that is passive. So when we look at the opposite of silence, or even the experience of intentionally choosing to or needing to listen, I mean, think about everything else we do actively with our bodies. That activates so many other different experiences, processes, systems in the body. It engages the brain in totally different ways anytime we're doing anything active versus passive. But how often do we think about, if at all, I'm actively listening versus just hearing, especially in our day-to-day life? It's so unique. But you also bring up something really unique that I might freak everybody out about. I'm that guy. I love MRI machines. I love.
You don't hear that every day.
You don't. I personally love tight, confined spaces. I love small places, and that rhythm of just. I fall asleep in MRI in about a minute, if that. Long story short, I go in for probably like MRI probably once a year for some follow up with some orthopedic issues on some previous injuries, and I look forward to it. They're like, "Hey, here's like the panic button. If you need it," I'm like, "Save it. I'm good. I'm gonna take a nap. We'll be fine." But for me, it's my personal example of what you're talking about, Justin. Of silence doesn't have to always be lack of sound. It is this experience that we're talking about. MRIs are not quiet, but for me, it introduces a state of stillness and quiet that I can just slip away. So can you speak to that, please? The difference between finding quiet when there's actually still a lot of noise going on.
Yeah. Well, we actually really came to understand this through our interviews. So we started out very much with, we started with an article for Harvard Business Review. We were really looking at noise and silence from an auditory lens. And it was quickly revealed to us, even though that, article was well received and got us started on this book project, when we started speaking with people, they were really pointing us towards experiences that were often auditorily loud, moments of awe, births, deaths, the 4 a.m. market.
Your favorite concert,
Yeah, totally. And so we were thinking like, okay, so are we not asking this? Like, are they not getting it? Are we not getting it? But we really started to get that what they were pointing us towards, and we're so glad we just like stayed with that inquiry. They were pointing us towards a deep internal quiet. And it was Professor Joshua Smythe at Penn State, who, when we asked him for this definition for internal quiet, he, in exasperation, said, quiet is what people think quiet is. Quiet is what people experience quiet to be. It's a completely subjective experience. And then he told us about a man in his studies who was a chainsaw carver who said, my deepest silence is when I'm carving a giant hunk of wood, into some art piece. So that pointed us towards flow states. So we got super interested in basically how many doorways there are that we can each walk through into internal quiet. That quiet is what we think quiet is. Your quiet is in an fMRI machine. My quiet is on the dance floor teaching dance. Justin's quiet is getting out in nature, feeling the rays of the sun, with the nature sounds going, cacophonously, but not laying claims on his attention. Right. And so this is what got super fascinating, is to look at that internal landscape of quiet.
I think a lot of people, and you all talk about this in the book and in your work a lot. I think one of the reasons why people are so hesitant to get still and quiet, despite whatever's going on in their life, their stressors, their everything, is there's a fear of what am I going to feel? What am I going to experience when I am just left alone with me, myself, and I? Can you talk to us, please, about the possible fear state we have in getting quiet, and what is so unique about a flow state or actual silence that induces fear for people? What is going on there?
Yeah, great question. There was a study at the University of Virginia several years ago when undergrads, had a chance to sit in silence alone or to push a button that would administer a painful electric shock. Yeah. And originally, all the participants had said that they would actually pay money to avoid being shocked. And then in the end, 67% of the men and 25% of the women chose to shock themselves rather than sit in silence. Like, that's how ingrained this is, what we're talking about. And
those are my people too. What's wrong with Virginia? I'm from Virginia. I got some questions for my homies there. What's going on?
Right, man. Yeah. And I think, and it's nothing about Virginia, nothing about right. Digital native generations. Even this isn't just a Gen Z thing, because a couple 100 years ago, Nietzsche talked about the horror of the vacuum, and in the mystic traditions around the world, there's this study of the meaning of deep silence, the dark night of the soul, the pit of the void in Christianity and Buddhism. So this is something that's ancient. And we look in the book at how, a couple thousand years ago, 2,500 years ago, one of the greatest genius inventors, wisest human beings known to humanity now, Pythagoras. He invented the long side. He found the long side.
Oh, he made my life miserable in high school with math. Yeah,
exactly, man. A lot of us remember him from high school math. He had that theorem about how to find the long side of a right triangle.
Is that a squared plus b squared is c squared, right? Is that him?
Man, you got a better memory for that than me.
Shout out, Mr. Lau.
But I think that's it. I think you're right.
My 8th grade math teacher killing it.
He's killing it, man. But he had a requirement that his inner circle of students spend 5 years in silence if they wanted to study with him. 5 years of not talking is how it's understood mostly. And we, in writing this book, we don't want to recommend that to anyone. We're not saying go spend 5 years in silence. If you want to, if you got the conditions to make that happen, go for it. But this is really a book about how to find silence for those of us who are living full lives, taking care of family members, taking care of what they care about in society, making podcasts, writing books, doing good work in the world. We want to explore how to find deep silence in this world of so much sound and stimulus. So we explore just like, what is it in that state of super deep silence that's scary? And at one level, it's the basic FOMO factor, Chase. I mean, it's the basic, what are you missing out? Not just 5 years in silence like Pythagoras, but those UVA students in 15 minutes. What am I missing on my phone? And some of that is what responsibilities am I missing in my life right now? It's not just a kind of like need to be checking Facebook, although that's some of it. But more deeply, as we enter the deeper silence, if you're going on a retreat for a few days or something like that, then we get into the silence where we have to face ourselves. The silence where we have to really look at who we are, what we care about, what we believe. But in the book, through interviews, through our own explorations, also through some explorations with people around psychedelics, because that could be really condensed time in deep silence. We look at this question of like, what is it that Pythagoras was getting at by requiring those 5 years in silence? And the answer that we come to is really pretty simple, but we think profound, which is that time in deep silence changes the architecture of the mind. Time in deep silence makes the mind gravitate away from performance and entertainment and wanting to fill the space toward the pursuit of truth.
You made me think of something that I know you all have asked in your work, and even in the recent podcast with Darren. I think, Justin, you even kicked it off this way of, you asked him, give us an example. What was your favorite memory or biggest memory of when you were the most quiet and still? And he was talking about, he was, I think, on his motorcycle driving through Colorado. And for me, it made me think of, all right, well, what was my most quiet moment in life? And this kind of ties into the fear aspect, I think, of getting quiet. When we go through certain experiences in life, consciously or subconsciously, there's an imprint of everything that happened in that moment of safety or scarcity, fear, life, death, whatever. And what came to mind for me was when I got the phone call. I was home on leave from the military. My father was in his last days being alive. He was suffering a terminal illness, ALS. And I was with him for several days, no sleep. I went home to catch up on some sleep. My sister kind of took the role. She went in and stayed with him. In like an hour after I got home, fell asleep, I got a phone call from a family friend, or my stepmom at the time. And she's like, he's gone, he's passed. And to this date, I mean, I've done a lot of silent stuff. I've done a lot of practices to get still and get quiet. But that moment for me was the quietest quiet I have ever experienced. And it's one I don't think I can replicate, because the difference here is I could never seek that out again. God forbid I have another horrible experience where I get a phone call like that, or anybody, but I'll never forget that moment of everything went dead. I stopped. I think I stopped breathing. It was just, I didn't breathe. I didn't think. I didn't make a noise. I was frozen in that moment in time, and time itself seemed to just stop, even though I knew this was coming.
Right.
And that stillness, that quiet, it is still palpable for me today. I can just think back on that. And so I share that example because I think it kind of ties back to the fear aspect. Someone like myself, why would I want to get into total silence again? Because consciously, subconsciously, I'm going to be revisiting one of the most horrific days of my life, one of the worst phone calls I ever got in my life. So there's trauma, heavy trauma imprinted there. And so I share that example to link back to the fear aspect, but also maybe for someone listening, watching, think about it. Why is it so difficult for you to choose to seek out stillness, to seek out quiet? Where maybe in life was quiet thrust upon you and made you feel anything other than warm and fuzzy? I think stillness and quiet have an interesting way to be experienced if we seek them out versus them finding us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chase, for sharing that. That one of the beautiful aspects of writing this book and asking so many people this question is that you're let right into a profound moment in someone's life. And the story I share in the book is also not like sunshine and rainbows. And so I get that. But it was a moment where I learned something profound about silence and then could seek it out in a more, optimal, happy, expansive, self-transcendent experience. But to know that, there's also that, when we're mentioning deaths and moments of awe even frequently are, or like they say, something like 20% of the time are terrifying moments of awe. They're not all bliss, void, and divisible. They're like terrifying
I can attest to that as well.
Awe. Yeah. So we are like, it's so rich to be looking at like what might be our aversion to the silence, where it might come from, what still might be gained in those experiences. And we have it, that place of timelessness, that place of expansion. So thank you for pointing us to that. We do look at self-transcendent experiences in a scientific area, a new emerging scientific area of study where people are feeling moments of awe, mystical experiences, but also in peak experiences, and those moments where all the things we seem to know, time, space, everything kind of changes. Our egoic self is, it's somehow right-sized. It's, it's smaller, we kind of leave that typical personality egoic self and maybe connect to something much bigger than ourselves. And that experience is quietening, but not always easy. It can rattle and shake, the ego can scratch and hate every moment of it. And it can be a really hard turning point in our lives. And it can be a place of great, where trauma, occurs as well. And so we like to look at really the different places of silence, and also the type of silence you're pointing us towards. And maybe I'll Justin take us into this. Is we spent a whole chapter looking at the silence of oppression, the silence is violence, the silence of censorship, because that was also very important to us. Silence hasn't been everybody's friend, and it can also be used to create harm. So that is not the type of silence we're talking about, but it felt important to take it head on. How is that distinct? We feel it's distinct because that type of silence of oppression, of complacency, of apathy is born of the world of noise. It's not clear, true intention. It's not connecting to the heart, to the truth of things. So we explore that in great lengths in one of our chapters.
Yeah. Justin, can you expand on that for us, please? That's really yet another fascinating point, another angle of silence.
Totally. And Chase, thanks again so much for sharing that. I was really moved by what you said, and it comes back to this idea of like, what is noise? It's not just sound. It's not just data. It's not just thoughts. Like, again, it's what's making claims on our consciousness and interfering with our real perception. And in those moments, like what you just shared about that experience you had with your dad, and that moment of doubt and that moment of, transition, it's like in those moments, what we've encountered for ourselves and for others, all of those ego games just fall away. All that stuff that's interfering with what's true just falls away, and we're present. We're in the moment. And that's, for most of the people we described, that's the deepest silence. So it's like you're not alone in that. And with what Leigh was describing about this idea of silence as complicity or complacency, silence as not saying what's true for you, silence as not standing up when something is not just, there is that side of silence. There's that side of silence that sometimes people say silence is violence. That can happen in the workplace, that can happen in our families, that can happen in society at large. But there's this flip side to it. Like when we're in a moment, like the moment you were describing, or Leigh alluded to her deepest silence in this moment, when she was, after having her daughter, like these are the moments when we're most connected to feeling. These are the moments when we're not thinking about, we're not thinking about how we look on social media. We're taking a temporary break from one of life's most important responsibilities, pervasive responsibilities, which is having to think of what to say. It's like taking a break from that need to keep up the constant discourse and conversation. So in these moments, like we were describing before with Pythagoras, like we were talking about with Pythagoras, there's this tuning into truth that happens when we're not in this space of needing to constantly perform, of needing to constantly think of what to say. And it's in that space that we could tune into what's really right, what's really true for us. So we look in the book to the example of Gandhi, who even during the busiest times of India's push for independence, in his role of leading that whole movement, he spent every Monday in silence. He spent every Monday not speaking a word, because he said a seeker after truth has to be silent. So it's like none of us is Gandhi, but it's like if he was able to do it at that level of busyness, we think, the rest of us could at least integrate a little bit of that.
Yeah, I would think so. I would definitely agree. And, just to expand on that a little bit, just think about it. Think about, all right, I'm going to take the next hour, next half day, next day, whatever. I'm going to choose silence. And I'm going to choose that by limiting the noise that I'm making. I'm not going to speak. How is that going to force you to get creative? How else are you going to be able to communicate, to go through your day, to run your errands, to work, to whatever? I mean, I don't know if this could work for everybody, but, just put on your thinking hat for a second. It's such a unique way to look at problem solving, living. But then on the opposite of that, it gets you to kind of think about what you might be we all take for granted if we have voice, if we can speak. Just the ease of life that comes with that. But also, what noise are we creating? Are we just unnecessarily flapping our gums sometimes? Are we talking too much? Are we, what constraints do we need to have around how we choose to use our voice, and how else could we get things done? And then, even reduce the noise pollution a little bit too. It's really, really interesting. It makes me think about, I'm curious about your take on the difference between noise and sound. And I think in pursuit of getting still and getting quiet, at least in my experience, I've gotten better at discerning between this is the noise in my life, meaning the things that are fighting for my attention, the notifications, whatever, versus just, sound. And it really kind of helps me become more of a discerning listener to take on my day and to be like, all right, you know what? This stuff can go because it's just noise. It's just noise that does not serve me, or I just need a little bit less of it. So can you expand on the difference between, sound and noise there, please?
Yeah, when we do break out noise, and this is a good time to maybe make a little bit more clarity right there. So we're looking at that auditory piece, and that's sound, right? And when it's not laying claims on our attention, we might just think of it as sound. Even sometimes like maybe not the most pleasant sound, but it's not like hijacking your attention. Information, it's just data until it's noise, and then it's like more like that attention grabbing data information. And then internally looking at the noise, it's just thoughts, and we love thoughts. It's just it could be daydreaming, it could be all kinds of wonderful things. But when it starts to maybe take over one's thinking, one's wellness, one's ability to focus on other things that they want to, then it becomes noise. So we make those distinctions because we love sound, and we love information and data, and we love thoughts. But it's that the real distinction is it's unwanted distraction.
Exactly.
So our
Keyword.
Ability to focus our attention, which is becoming harder and harder and harder all the time, and align that focus with our actual intention, our purpose for being here, the way we spend our time and with whom we spend it and how, and all that is being encumbered, interrupted, and distracted all the time. And this is like deeply concerning. This is not just for us anyway, just about not being as productive as we can be, although that's concerning. It's about not living our lives as we are here to do. That's what noise is. It's getting in the way of that.
And Chase, I love how you describe that with, just being more discerning with speech generally. Reminds me of someone we speak to in the book, in chapter 2 of the book, named Cyrus Habib. who grew up son of Iranian immigrants to the US, went blind when he was 8 years old, went on to become a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford,
Yeah.
went to Yale Law School. He became the lieutenant governor of Washington State when he was in his 30s. And then Cyrus shocked everybody by deciding not to run for the US Senate or governor, but instead to take a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience as a novice Jesuit priest. And he said, you know, most people thought he was totally nuts. That was what he assumed when he made that decision. And when he first left the lieutenant governor's office and went to this novitiate to be in silence for a whole month, he was caught up just in thinking, what do other people think of me? Do they think I'm crazy? And even though there was no noise around him, he wasn't talking, you know, anything, he was in such a state of internal noise because he was caught up in thinking, what do people think of me? He realized he was caught up in this mode where he derived his value in life from what other people thought of him. So he explained, like, you can get rid of all the auditory noise, even all the informational noise, but unless you shift the internal perception of sound and stimulus toward an appreciation of the present moment, an appreciation of silence, unless you do that, the noise will persist. But he says the opportunity, once you do that, is to become a connoisseur of creation.
Ooh. Oh, I like that term. I like that.
We
Who doesn't
love
want to
that
become
too.
a connoisseur of creation? That's amazing.
Exactly.
And it's funny, when we were talking with Cyrus, like every metaphor he would give us was about food. he loved the food metaphor, but he was describing literally, like, he could taste the food more. You know, he could smell the food more. Like, he was more present once he made that choice.
Oh, that's a hack that you know, kind of going back to my old health coaching days. That's actually something that I would recommend. I know a lot of other people in the fitness nutrition space do as well. How do I get my client to lose weight or just become more aware of what they're eating? Well, odds are they're not aware. They're not present. They're not mindful while eating. So, I mean, how many of us now, we're eating, watching TV, talking on our phone, maybe all the above? Yeah, I mean, you got to do what you got to do sometimes, but if you actually were fully aware and present of what you're eating while you're eating it, what you're drinking while you're drinking it, there is great power in that. And you slow things down naturally. You chew your food longer and more. It improves digestion. You're going to become fuller quicker. You're going to lower portions. It's a quick little hack there for some people when it comes to kind of just the general health space. But Justin, you make me think of, this is a perfect kind of expansion point here. I took down a note of yours of it was stop confusing, you know, I should just stop remembering. I'm just going to go to my note. There we go. Stop mistaking stress for aliveness.
Right.
How many of us are just, if we got real and took a step back of all the noise in our life and really described what it is, it's just stress. It's bombarding our attention. It's these weapons of mass distraction. But in this day and age, we probably either we grew up or we just assume now it's the norm that means I'm stimulated. That means I'm busy. That means I'm active. That means I'm engaged. I've got all these things coming in. When in reality, only some of that might be true. We are confusing stress for aliveness. I love that, man.
Chase, I really love how you're describing that with food too. I mean, because one of the main ideas in this book is that there's feedback loops between the kinds of noise. Noise begets noise. So when things are loud in our ears, it drives the fight or flight response. When things are noisy on our screens, informationally noisy, that also drives that same fight or flight response and leads to more noisiness in our heads. And there's no perfect way to study that in neuroscience, but the neuroscientists and academic psychologists and psychiatrists we spoke to all validated for us in different ways. And what you're talking about with food is the same thing. It's like once we're in that fight or flight response, we're not paying attention to how the food tastes. You know, so we're binging junk food, or we're just not really thinking about what we're putting into our bodies or how healthy it is. And you could say that with all sorts of behaviors. But basically, it's like, in order to improve the quality of our lives, you know, health, enjoyment, satisfaction, the quality of our company to our friends and loved ones, It all depends on turning down this level of
Oof.
interference with our perception and intention. It
Yeah.
depends, as you were just talking about, reducing this state of stress. And more fundamentally, though, it requires that shift that we stop thinking of that fight or flight state as the ideal state of optimal performance, because it's not.
Yeah.
Really optimal living and performance is savoring. It's this state I was mentioning of being a connoisseur of creation.
Yeah.
And silence is like the sandbox. Silence is like where we can do the work of tuning ourselves
Truly.
to be able to appreciate creation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're not saying like you just need to be in silence all day. We're just saying if you can tune your senses to silence, then you can appreciate the food, you can appreciate the dancing, you can appreciate the work, you can, whatever it is, tune to the silence and then appreciate the stimulus and sound of your life.
So true. And kind of on the health wellness train here, Leigh, you're a former smoker, right?
I am.
I'll raise my hand. I was that guy, young soldier, 19, 20 years old, grabbing a smoke whenever I could. But I think for similar reasons, brings me to my next point of potentially unhealthy or unserving habits we have in our lives that are not the thing. I talk about this all the time on the show. The thing is never the thing. The thing is rarely ever the thing. So I heard this about you, and I wrote down just smoking. The things we do to achieve what we are actually after. And in this case, is silence. And you were talking about how the smoke break, I was giving up the smoke break. It was my time away. It was my break. It was my silence. Well, we're not after the cigarette. We're not after the smoking. We're after what it gives us. It actually is an excuse to take a break. And that was exactly my case. All the other guys in my unit, like they got to go take a smoke break, every couple hours. And I'm like, well, screw that. I want to go. I don't want to miss out. There's the FOMO. I want to take a break. I want to chill. And so that's literally one of the biggest contributing factors to what got me smoking for a short period of time. But it just made me think about the excuses we make just to grab a few moments of precious silence.
Yeah, we have a chapter in the book called The Healthy Successor to the Smoke Break, where I do make that confession. And it's a confession really about all the sensory experiences I had as well, just the beauty of watching the smoke and the sizzle of the cigarette and the dangling on my lips and the deep inhale and the deep exhale. So there was a whole sensory experience that I wasn't giving myself in other parts of my life, but I was somehow getting in smoking. And there was also this reset, this deep quiet, because we didn't have phones back then. We just heard recently, Justin and I were told by a smoker, oh, now everybody just looks at their phones during the smoke break. And we thought, oh man, even the smoke breaks are ruined. But, I'm so glad I quit. And, but when I did, I lost that regular, break, the deep inhale, the deep exhale, the stepping outside, the sometimes connecting in a different way with humans and, just like, deepening that relationship or even connecting with nature. So we ask, what is the healthy successor to the smoke break? And we have lots of ideas about that. And, when we interview people from all different different walks of life, ages, and, different settings and things, we're really trying to get a vast array of, some wild and off the wall ideas and some things that you might resonate with, but that we invite the reader into an experimental mindset that they check it out. Just try it out. So one of them is to just listen. And this actually kind of takes us back full circle to what you were pointing us towards, that not just here, but just listen, where you're really listening into the sounds and the wind and the trees or the birds or whatever, and in that way that Justin was describing in the study, to just listen. And with one of our interviewees, she did that after really intense work as a news correspondent. She'd come home, she'd sit on the couch and just listen. At first, it was just to the ringing in her ears, and that would morph to and change. And then she would just, after just a couple minutes, get up and start dinner. It's just like that was the practice. Now, little did she know it, that's actually an ancient Indian practice called Nada Yoga that she had just, figured out on her own.
Wow.
And it can be that simple. We also invite people to just like when we're in long lines or our phones just die or whatever, to not just cram in more, to not get frustrated, to take that moment as a gift of silence. And that's just, bound to happen to any of us in the next week, just a little gift of silence. Can we just meet that moment, not fill it, not reach for the phone, and just like take in our surroundings? We use our senses, just observe and be present and appreciate the silence. Yeah. There's so many others. What else would you add, Justin? What other ideas come to mind?
Yeah, this idea of the smoke break. And I've heard that from other friends of mine who are vets who are in the military about that smoke break.
We're just a bunch of dirt bags.
No, it makes sense though, man, to need that moment, to just do nothing, to just inhale, exhale, and just be present and not think about everything you're dealing with. And it's like, how can we find these healthy ways, as Leigh was saying, to integrate that into our lives, but also like as a culture, workplace cultures, the whole economy, the whole thing, how can we appreciate the importance of these spaces to step away and not just do something to, find diversion or distraction, but to just go as deeply as we can into the silence.
Oh, yeah.
So we look at a lot of different ways to do that, as Leigh was saying. We look at an ancient Japanese concept called ma, which means empty space. It means open space. It means the empty space between notes and music. It means the empty space between brushstrokes and artwork or flower arranging. And another word for ma is pure potentiality. So it's this Japanese aesthetic principle. And we look at what would it mean to bring ma into our days. So maybe that's, when you're walking into a new room, before you turn the doorknob or the handle, you take a moment and just listen to the silence, even if it's just a fraction of a second. Maybe it's 1 second, maybe it's 2 seconds. Rather than the quantity of the silence, think about the quality of the silence. How deeply can you go into the silence that's just available to you for a moment?
That is so powerful. Wow.
So we look at that in a bunch of different ways, bunch of different contexts. We look at that too, expanding outwards. Like if you have a little bit more time, if you have a day, can you get out to the most remote place you can get in a day? Maybe you drive somewhere a little far from home and then you hike deep into the woods or to a remote beach or waterfall or some place that's really feels like pristine quiet, the furthest you could get to in a day. And take your to-do list with you. And when you get there, look at your to-do list. And then once you've tuned into the silence, cross off everything that doesn't really matter.
I bet you can knock off a lot.
We talked to someone named Gordon Hempton, who's one of the world's top acoustic ecologists. And he told us he did that recently in the Olympic National Park. And he was able to cross off 5 months of professional commitments.
Wow.
Because once he got deep into the silence, all this stuff that when he was in that endemic fight or flight state that he was in at his desk, all that stuff, when he really tuned into the silence, it didn't really matter. And he got back to the essence of what really mattered, which again comes back to like what we were talking about with your deepest silence, like thinking about the love of a family member, what really matters in this deep silence. It brings things back to their essence. So we look at a bunch of different ideas for this. We look at that same concept of ma, of that pure potentiality. What would it mean to bring that into our workplaces in the sense of how we operate as a culture? For example, meetings and brainstorming sessions. What would it mean to do brainstorming in silence, or to safeguard times of silence, to really do deep thinking together? Or maybe you brainstorm entirely in silence and you just put ideas up with a Post-it note, so you don't have the the same kind of tyranny of the fastest and loudest.
Yeah, truly. Even just in those micro moments you're talking about, never underestimate the power of a pause. Pausing in between actions, in between going from outside to inside, before you start your car, before you pick up the phone, before you do anything. For all my other podcasters out there, in an interview, don't think that you always need to just have something else to say. Or in human experience, you're talking in a conversation with a stranger, with your partner, with whoever. We feel, I think there's this compulsion to just always be filling the silence. We don't want to feel awkward. We don't want to make the other person possibly feel awkward. That moment of awkwardness, air quote here, lives so much more in our heads than in reality. And what we think is just infinite awkward silence is a brief flash in the pan of what we're actually experiencing. That whole last concept there, Justin, Leigh, thank you so much for that. It is such a powerful takeaway, from this conversation and, in the work. I love how you all kind of present all angles of this, from your personal experiences, the growth of your work and the research and the interviews. And for me, it drives home one of the biggest, most important messages I think we can take away from this. And that is, all right, cool. Maybe we've heard about silence and getting still and quiet and all this stuff. I need to find ways to get it. I need to go out and find it. There exists, and this is so wild. I was just on a coaching call earlier today with a guy. Shout out Dom if you're listening. And we were talking about this, and we kind of realized, I was sharing with him, he was asking me, how do I do it? How do I find stillness? How do I find the quiet? And I was like, yeah, I have a lot of these practices, Justin, like a lot of the things you're talking about, getting out there, carving out time, getting away. But stillness is among us all the time. Quiet, particularly like we're talking about before, that experience of quiet, that flow state exists in our daily lives all the time. It is just a matter of what are we using instead of it? Where are we missing the gift, missing the opportunity? This has been a practice of mine for a little while now. If I see somebody else, I'm out to dinner, I'm in line, whatever, waiting to board a plane, I see someone, pull out your phone, like we all do now. I think a lot of us in between, if we have 3 seconds, we're checking our phone in between whatever, in a commercial. I take the trigger here is them getting on their phone for me to not. And I have tried consciously to, any time where I would be reaching for my phone, like phantom vibration, phantom notification, or just let me scroll or check whatever. I'm like, no, here's the gift of stillness. I am being given a moment, several moments to just do nothing, to sit, to stand, to be quiet, to be chill. So if you're struggling to find it, my point here is, if you're struggling to find quiet time and to get still, to get quiet, I challenge you to really look at your day and see where it's being given to you and you're just missing the opportunity.
That is so spot on. We really, in our own lives, we kind of struggled with this at first, just like what kind of book about silence were you writing? And we really landed on, this is not a book for people who are going off on retreats for 6 months out of a year.
We're not doing a Vipassana.
We're not doing that. That's not what's happening here. We're really interested in the type of silence we find in this life that we have, which is super full. We have kids, we have little kids, we have, there's a lot going on with our professional lives, and just we want it that way. And yet still silence can be found in those micro moments. And then we can learn to kind of build our capacity in that. There's some innate wisdom in us. We know our way to quiet if we just take the time, maybe play around with some of these ideas in your life, enroll people, loved ones who could be on board. It will deepen the intimacy and the connection in those relationships. It'll allow you to work differently with others. And in our case, we're doing a lot of stuff where it's like, it really matters. They're trying to remove toxic chemicals from products, or they're addressing climate change. And we want novel thinking coming in. We want breakthrough thinking coming in. We don't want conventional thinking. So that requires mixing it up. And silence is just, it's accessible. It's, it's there for everybody. We know our way. And so that's, and of course, building in the deeper silence that Justin was pointing us towards, that, even rapturous silence, we like to call it,
Wow.
like go for that, do that. It's it's a beautiful thing. I'll just say, like last night I went to this performance, and it was the first performance since COVID for this group. And they had, in the meantime, one of the young women, front women, had suffered a tumor in her brain that she had to have removed. It was a very serious time for her on top of COVID. So this was their first performance. And they just did this beautiful musical performance woven with like little voice memos because she couldn't look at a phone. Her brain was not allowing for it. So they left voice memos. And then at the end of that performance, there was complete silence. We held a group of 500 people just held absolute silence, just out of the deepest respect and joy that we were here having this moment. I feel like teary telling you about it. And this is one of those things, like, we can actually enjoy this as a society at large, as a culture at large, and transform how we are together. Yeah.
Damn, that's so, I mean, I'm just imagining being in a room like that, of that size. You know, my favorite concert, what would happen if, you know, the artist and everybody in it was just dead silent for a while? I mean, there's such power in being silent together. There's energy, which again, you all talk about. Well, there's so many other offshoots from this book and this work that I loved and I appreciated. So I just want to, you know, as we begin to wrap up here, just say thank you for this work. I think it was such a powerful and necessary and interesting take on a concept I at least have become pretty familiar with. Leigh, I was sharing with you before Justin joined us that Stillness is the Key is one of my favorite works of the last few years from Ryan Holiday. And that's a book that I recommend all the time, you know, for a lot of different reasons. There's immense power to be had in getting still and getting quiet. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean dead silence. You know, it's an experience.
Right.
Well, I want to ask you all, kind of bringing it home to the theme of the show here, to kind of take this information that you've shared that can help empower us, to help us take a step forward, one step forward in our life here today, to live a life ever forward. I want to ask your takeaway on that. Leigh, let's start with you, please. When you hear ever forward, what does it mean to you? How do you live a life ever forward?
I think at my best when I'm living that life, I'm transcending and including what has occurred. Transcending and including on the path. Yeah.
Justin, please, I would love to hear your interpretation as well. Ever forward, what does that mean to you, man?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chase. I like that framing for this podcast, ever forward. And in the book, we think about the meaning. What does it mean for us to move forward as a society, as a culture, as a people? And we look a lot at how we tend to measure progress by measures like GDP, like gross domestic product, economic growth. And the problem with that is that it measures what we're producing, the industrial output, the sound and speech and stimulus we're creating, you know, the way we measure our economy, GDP. If we cut down a forest and sell the wood at Home Depot, that counts as a positive. But if we leave that forest intact, we don't measure the value. And you could say the same thing about human attention and sound and noise. If we make a lot of noise, if we chop up our attention and turn it into, you know, eyeballs on a Facebook screen, you know, Facebook page that can sell advertising revenues in our society, that counts as GDP, that counts as progress. But what if we leave our attention pristine, intact, pure, presence with nature, presence with our children, presence in our lives? What if we value that as progress, as forward movement? So we propose this idea in the book that maybe the idea of progress, you know, maybe this idea of ever forward is more and more appreciation, more and more presence, not just more and more stuff, you know, material stuff, not just more and more mental stuff, but more and more of that state, this state I was describing of being a connoisseur of creation. You know, and this comes for us through tuning into the silence, through appreciating the silence and bringing this forward into our speech and into our appreciation of all the wonders of this life.
There's never a right or wrong answer, I always say. So thank you so much for your interpretations. And just to kind of give my 2 cents here as we wrap up, my listeners know the story of Ever Forward and this mantra of my late father. When I first started this show and when Ever Forward was first introduced by my family years ago, it was really out of necessity for us to find meaning to something that didn't make sense. And to help us, and I might just be speaking for myself here, but I think my family would agree in some way, we had to find a way to just push on. And when we just push on, it can serve us. There's a time and a place. But for me, it was ever forward, right? Like no matter what, no matter literally, even though my father died, I'm going to keep going. And there's something really powerful when we choose to do that, when we choose to turn our adversity into an advantage, when we choose to turn the obstacle into the way. But in the long run, I don't know how long that can really serve us. And I was asked this a couple months ago, well, Chase, what does that mean to you? And it really made me think how much I have slowed down, how much I have excelled by slowing down, how much noise I've been able to create by getting quiet. And it's so wild. Like here I am now in 2022, as we're recording this, ever forward for me means how here and now, still and quiet, whether that's noise free or a flow state, can I get and live as present as possible in that moment, however short or long it might be. Because in true presence, in stillness, lives and lies eternity. And in that, I have been able to take a step forward. And when I do, it's just like balls to the wall kind of thing, So It sounds kind of counterintuitive, but by slowing down and getting still and quiet, I've been able to propel myself forward in ways I never thought possible.
Oh, we so get that. That is so beautifully put. We have a motto we say, slow down, there isn't much time.
Yeah. My military training, we're drilled in, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. It's so important. So important. Well, again, thank you so much for your time and your work here. I'm going to have the book listed for everybody in the show notes, the video notes, Golden, The Power of Silence in a World of Noise. And we actually teamed up with you guys. We're doing a little giveaway, so stay tuned. I'll have more details in the intro for this clip, but we got a few copies to kind of share out with the world. So thank you guys.
Oh, thank you so much for that.
Chase, it's such a joy to do an interview where you learn things about the topic of your own book. And what you were describing about, for example, when someone pulls out their phone, that's a cue for you to put your phone away. And the way you reflected on this, the way you shared your, your deepest silence, the meaning of silence. I learned a lot, man. Got a lot from your reflections.
Yeah.
And,
that's cool to hear.
It's cool to hear. It's cool to write a whole book and then just keep learning from friends and people you know.
That's so cool. The pleasure was all mine. Well, thank you guys so much.